All right, so let's see if we can get the energy up as we kind of go into the next formal break. I'm here to talk to you today about this concept of skill liquidity and a little bit of marketing on the topic beyond cross-functionality. It's not really just about talking about that and contrasting it, but it does have a part in my story. So I'm Martin Aziz. I'm part of a small but powerful partnership called Squirrel North out of Canada. We do all sorts of things Kanban. So we train, we coach, we consult. So anyway, that's a bit about our background. You've maybe set up Kanban in your organization, and you're doing it with your team, you're doing it with a service, and yet, have you ever come to a spot in time where, like, you know, we have enough people. Why are things stuck? Has that ever happened to anyone here? Like, we have enough people. Everything should be moving, right? And yet it's not. Stop, stop, stop throughout your Kanban system, whether you're using Kanban or not, really. And so there's a harsh reality that, you know, comes into play that, you know, we're human beings. We're part of, you know, all the work that needs to get done in order to deliver some sort of value in knowledge work. We're not that interchangeable, right? We can interchange, but it takes work. It takes time. We can learn new skills, right? So this idea of liquidity really comes kind of as a borrowed term from, you know, has anyone heard the term like cash is liquid, right? You could easily convert cash into something else, right? So there's very little friction. I can go out and buy anything with currency and get some other type of asset. When it comes to people, you're in kind of fairly static configurations, and you have to kind of deal with that reality. So, you know, that's kind of a bit of, okay, so there's upside, people are unique, so you have access to all sorts of cool ideas and thoughts, but at the same time, they're not interchangeable. But also, the cool thing about people is they can adapt, right? So the question is, you know, is there a way to organize effectively so that, you know, you can overcome some of these challenges and leverage the adaptability of people? Don't discount the fact that it's actually quite difficult to interchange people, right? So the idea, so that's kind of giving you a bit of a definition of this problem around skill liquidity. A lot of what you're seeing in Kanban is trying to actually deal with that problem without necessarily talking about it in a very overt way. In my organization, when I had a role where I had to basically be responsible for delivery of quite a number of services. You know, this came up as an ongoing thing, right? So I've been spending, you know, several years trying to think about what are the various patterns that I need to think about as we consider this idea of, you know, maximizing liquidity so that I'm not constantly in this kind of stop state all the time. So how do we deal with that? Not just in one team, not just in one service, but, you know, from a whole organization perspective. So you're dealing with that. At the same time, who kind of feels that they operate in a market where the needs of your customers are changing all the time? Who feels that the needs of your customers are changing every now and then? All right. So, you know, I spend a lot of time speaking with executives, and they not only bring that up a lot, but they also say that it feels like it's getting worse. It feels like that pattern is accelerating, right? And so this idea of not only do we have to accept that our customers, their needs are changing, but actually that their needs are changing in a rapid pace. And I'm not sure what the source is. There's also speculation about the rise of different technology allowing us to go and do different things and have different expectations. So everyone has a smartphone now, perhaps that it. So I don't know what the real reason is, but I do hear it a lot. And so you may hear the term VUCA used in corporate settings, and that has come up quite a few times. but I've heard all sorts of different terms used for that concept. But the idea is, you're dealing with uncertainty, volatility, ambiguity. You don't know what's going to happen. You're not sure where the customer sentiment is going to go. So you got to deal with that. Now, this idea of skill liquidity also needs to consider the fact that there's various ways you can deal with this challenge, but is it appropriate for you, right? And so when I tried different things, I came to some dead ends, or at least dead ends at the time, because they were ideas that may not be, they weren't necessarily a right fit for the organization that I was supporting. So, whether it is different patterns around skill specialization, or patterns around cross-functional teams, or patterns that are a little bit different from that, the question arose is that particular formula actually effective for the business that you're in based on where they're at? So how do we actually kind of get a sense of whether that's actually a good fit or not? And as it happens, we released the KMM not too long ago, and that became a bit of an aha moment for me, where I realized that there are things in here that tell us, and there's signals and clues to say, there's some readiness that says, there is a particular way we can deal with skill liquidity that's now available to us that didn't used to be there before, as we rise up the maturity ladder here, right? So if you are in a high maturity organization and you're dealing with a fairly a low maturity skill liquidity pattern, it might be an opportunity to try something else. The concern there is if in the inverse, if you're trying to adopt something that is quite mature and you're a low maturity organization, you could run into trouble, which was what I found myself in, where I had these mismatches. So this rise of the KMM is actually quite useful when we're talking about appropriateness of different patterns and liquidity. So what I did was I actually started to codify what were some of the big things that I had used and I had heard from others, and tried to map that against the Kanban Maturity Model. And so I have identified five discrete areas that are mapped against KMM to say, if you are at this level of maturity, then you are probably in a good spot to be able to leverage this skill liquidity technique, because you have a lot of things in place that allow it to occur. And so this idea of appropriateness becomes a pretty important thing that you get to get a sense of, okay, so am I ready and am I in a spot where I can actually try something a little bit more? So what are some signs of poor skill liquidity patterns in your organization? And I'll share the one that I experienced the most. It's this kind of shuffle that happens every now and then. Who here has been through a reorganization? Right? So it's not the only necessary reason, but when I started to think about it in the background, it's like there were times where I could just say, it just got to a point where the current match between how we've organized against a whole bunch of skills against what the market needs has just become untenable. Essentially, there was a mismatch. We organized some way in the past that made perfect sense for us, and then all of a sudden it doesn't. Right? And actually, it didn't for some time, but we were willing to live with the pain until it just became too awful. And the pain of continuing in that way was worse than the pain of reorganization, so we decided to reorganize. Right? So, if you leave this talk, you may want to go look back at all the reorgs that you've been part of and say, how much of that was as a result of we just had the wrong people, wrong places, wrong skills, and it was a complete mismatch, and then just we were declaring bankruptcy on that model, and we just decided to go in and reshuffle the deck. All right, so maybe that's why we care about liquidity. So let's talk about sort of the lowest level here, which has kind of been around for a while. So this is a scene from the Battle of the Bastards from Game of Thrones. Any people watch Game of Thrones here? You've probably seen this scene, right? Lots of blood and stuff going on with this one. But you know what? It's kind of a good point that this stuff's been around for a while, right? So we clearly have skill specialization happening in this medieval or mock medieval fight where you have archers, you have cavalry, you have pikemen, and they have different advantages, right? So, archers, they're at the front, they're dealing with range. Cavalry, earlier skirmishes, and then as things get closer in combat, you get your pikemen, right? So, the challenge of, do you have the wrong amount of each? You might lose the battle as a result of that. Your archer, as soon as you get to a certain range, you got to put the bow down. It's kind of useless. But it's relatively effective, right? So you can do a bunch of things with that. You can certainly form an army, and you can certainly win certain battles in these kind of wars of attrition that used to be commonplace. So the illustration here is, chances are, if you have a level 0 organization, you probably are organized based on skill specialization, right? There's a good chance that that's how you do it. And so there are some things you get out of it, right? You get, a straightforward hiring process, right? So you can write a job description and put it out there on your favorite website, get your recruiter to come in and say, we need, a Oracle DBA or something like that. I got to be able to do this and that, right? And the other upside is, you got all sorts of opportunity for, spending years on something, and you develop your personal craftsmanship. Individuals may like this, right? And so just to illustrate, these avatars I have here, they have different shapes behind them, just kind of represent the skills that they're bringing to the table. So there's a circle guy, and there's triangle, and there's square. So the challenge with this is, over time, this configuration is no longer a fit, right? And so you have too many circles, not enough triangles, or the diamond that you never thought you needed is suddenly the thing you need, right? So then you end up with situations like this, where at some point, hiring this guy made a lot of sense, right? At some point, someone said, yeah, we need him, right? Who, by the way, has seen this movie? All right, if you haven't seen Office Space, you got to see it. I mean, it's kind of like required entry to a conference like this at this point. But so at some point it made sense, and at some point, not to sort of spoil the movie, but at some point you realize that this guy has been forgotten for like years, and nobody knows what he does, right? And then nobody had the guts to fire him, so they just put him in the basement. Hopefully, he'll forget us, we'll forget him, and let's just move on, right? So these are kind of like signs of, over time, things that make sense don't make sense anymore. And organizations are spending money, and they're not reaching their business objectives. So it's an easy thing to get to, but a very poor model. So let's go up. Let's go beyond skill specialization, and let's talk about multi-skilled people. And so, there's various terms I've heard used. The one that the Agile space has sort of made very popular is this concept of T-shaped people. So the idea of, you have your core specialization, and then you have a bunch of auxiliary skills, right? And I think that's pretty old too. So Genghis Khan, probably one of the most successful military strategists, generals, leaders, whatever, conquered a big portion of the world. And if you look at the history of that, you realize that the advantage they had was really adaptability during battles, and they could deal with a wide variety of scenarios. And this was one of the things they had. They had the idea of this mounted archer, right? So now you have multi-skilled, right? You have the ability of the speed and range of both a cavalryman as well as an archer, right? Firing down, sideways, back, all sorts of possibilities are now possible based on the fact that you're now combining a bunch of skills. And so this is not necessarily a new idea. It's been around, right? So the idea of having people with multiple skills, you're now dealing with delays, right? So things that used to be handed over to different specialists, maybe we can do it with fewer of those. And so you reduce the frequency of requests for other specializations. Again, you might actually have people who like this because, they might want to pick up new skills. So if you're an organization and you're promoting this sort of idea. Yeah, so now I have employees that are maybe more engaged because they realize I can go and pick up new skills, and the organization is going to be supportive of that. And now it makes the hiring process a little bit more challenging because now you got to look for people who are willing to do this sort of thing, right? So not only am I looking for the specialization that I'm looking for, but also, how flexible is this person, both in terms of talent, but also in desire, right? And so that makes the things a little bit more complicated. And then, so they're not infinite T's either, right? So they don't have all the skills. So eventually these bottlenecks of, transferring work to others will persist. So you've dealt with some of your delays, but, most of the delays are still there, right? You just don't have one person being able to do everything. So, the idea of, every employee being kind of a Renaissance person with every potential skill is a little bit of fantasy. The other thing, obviously, is identity. You have to kind of realize that it's not for everyone. So, at the end of the day, whether it's a doctor saying, I don't want to do this other stuff because, I didn't go to med school to, optimize your database, right? Or, I'm an Oracle DBA and I don't want to become a tester. I worked hard to become an Oracle DBA, right? And I go to the Oracle conferences and I don't go to the testing conferences, right? And so this idea of identity is something that's rooted in our humanity. And so the idea of multi-skilled people is, there's limits to what you expect, not only how many skills, but who is actually willing to do that. All right. So next up, cross-functional teams. Who's heard of cross-functional teams? Everybody, right? It's the darling of Agile, right? Wasn't invented by Agile. Been around in more modern configurations of military units. It's got some upsides, right? So you have this idea of a modern military squad that has various different capabilities, and they can go in and adapt to a wider variety of situations. It's not just 5 pikemen. It's not just 5 archers. They can, deal with all sorts of medical issues on the spot. The amount of handoffs become reduced in terms of the reliance on other squads, right? So this idea of pooling people and pooling skills becomes encapsulated in this idea of team. And so there's upside to this. You take something like, imagine you wanted to have a product that had 3 features, the circle, the triangle, and the square feature. The old specialist teams, you need to have 3 of them. You'd have to have handoffs and sources of delay and who knows what. And in the cross-functional team, no handoffs, manage that a little bit better, lower transaction costs, potentially more effective. So kind of not bad. More possibilities, right? So three specialist teams get together, 1 possibility, 3 cross-functional ones. Now you got way more possibilities, right? So now if you're trying to go in and respond to the market, you get some upside here, right? So you have fewer handoffs, you have more possibilities, you're adapting a little bit faster. So again, you're now 1 level up on the maturity model. You've reduced even more delays. You can also still be multi-skilled, so there's nothing saying that the individuals inside the actual team is not multi-skilled. So teams can produce all sorts of stuff. And yet, you knew there was a but coming, right? Right? So how come I'm still in this situation? So that was what I was going through. Every 6 months, the musical chairs happen. We'd get around, and now we'd have to move in to different spots. So here's a scenario that I found pretty frequently. So let me explain how this diagram is set up. So you have 2 teams here, and they're all set up to work on the most important work for the organization. Team number 1, they got to work on circles. Team number 2, triangles, right? think of that stuff as their pool of options has been sorted, they've replenished, and they decided that that's the most important thing. Now, the key thing here, it's been filtered by their ability, right? And so let's introduce the concept of what are the organization's needs. Team 1, not bad. Team 2, they're working on something very low, right? And the other stuff is forced to wait. And guess what? Maybe triangle is not even a good idea to do anyway. Maybe we should have never done it, right? But it's the thing they can do. And so, you know, when I was experiencing this, there was this travel team that kind of sparked this idea for me. And in the company I was supporting, at some point they had decided that they were going to build a whole kind of travel website, kind of like your Expedia experience. And they had put together a whole bunch of teams to do that. So they were cross-functional, they could do a bunch of things, but clearly in the travel space. A few years later, they're still cranking out travel features at the same rate. And yet, the organization had already moved to other priorities. And so they were being killed in other areas, and yet they were just cranking out feature after feature in the travel space, right? Complete mismatch. So, the idea is you're trying to get everyone, what's the word I'm looking for? Everyone is trying to be utilized the best you can, right? And so that's the kind of underlined word, utilization, right? So this kind of promotes a certain utilization where, let's keep team number 2 busy because, we're not quite ready we don't even know why we should give up on them. We haven't decided that we're going to give them new skills. And let's just keep on cranking out. And in the local setting, maybe people are even being promoted. Hey, look how fast this team is. We're cranking out new travel features. From an organization perspective, who cares? We don't need them. It's not gaining us more customers. The customers that we already have aren't asking for these things. And yet it continues on. So, that's a bit of a problem. And then so the other thing is the reality of, delivering product is not a one-team game in most situations, right? Delivering services of any kind of larger, complex environment is not this idea of a single team owning the whole chain all the way from the I promise moment from the customer to here it is. So there's going to be handoffs to other groups. So that's delay there, and there's delay there. And so there's a mismatch. Team, we're so fast. Customer here is saying, why did I wait for so long, right? Because that stop happened after the team or before the team, and so some combination of what's going on. So it's kind of unmanaged. Right? That's the kind of real problem here. And then you look at the identity thing here is the concept of tribes needs to be understood. And so these teams that are cross-functional in nature, and we talk about stable teams too, do they develop their own microcultures? And are you now in situations where organizational goals are incongruent with team goals, right? And so this idea of, we are the travel team versus we are part of this organization and we want the organization to be successful, right? So you have this friction of where do your tribal boundaries actually lay. And so this idea of your skill liquidity pattern based on a team formula starts to introduce the issue of how to deal with that, right? Maybe you can deal with it, but you have to figure out how. All right, so enough about teams. Let's talk about the next level up. And I call this service liquidity. And so obviously we're now going into a more mature Kanban space. And the idea is looking at it from the perspective of services. And so there's this huge construction site that's actually just a block away from where I live. And they're building 6 towers at once. I think the shortest of the 6 is about 45 stories, and the tallest is somewhere in the 60 or so. So it's huge. You can imagine how big this site is. And there's a digger there, and it's building a massive hole because I think they have four basement levels of parking for the whole thing. So they're going deep. And this digger, its job is obviously to build a hole and build the hole as fast as possible so they can start building the building. And it's huge. Its digger is massive. I was looking at it, and it basically scoops, and 2 scoops is 1 dump truck. Right? 2 scoops, 1 dump truck. And so I'm like, oh my God, that's huge. And then I also realized that the thing never stops. They start at around 6 a.m., they finish around 7 p.m., and the digger never stops. Never, ever stops. And someone, obviously some smart person as part of that, has realized that if the digger stops, the hole is not being built. Right? Now, in order for the digger to stop, every time there's a scoop, there's got to be a dump truck waiting, right? Right? And so I was starting to calculate how many. And it was 60, give or take. I wasn't very precise, but I was adding up how many I saw on the highway at what rate they were coming back. So about 60 dump trucks to keep this one digger going. And so there was no kind of dump truck department that was trying to maximize their utilization, and there was no digger department, right? The scope was a service, right? And we needed to have enough liquidity on dump trucks to ensure that the digger was never going to be idle, right? And so this is the thinking around this maturity level where it's not about keeping a team going. It's not about a cross-functional dump truck team, right? It's about keeping the hole built. Let's get that hole built as fast as possible. So the cool thing is, these guys they can see it because there's this visceral thing, and so they don't have to deal with unhiding. They don't have to deal with visualization. They can just see digger moving, digger not moving, right? All right, so the idea here is you're dealing with services, and so we know that a wide variety of skills are required to get the service done. Diggers, dump trucks, whatever it is, right? A bunch of shapes. And so the idea here is you need to have some sort of combination of maybe dynamic teams, maybe shared services, but the idea is the work is not going to the teams or to the individuals, but they are going to where the work is, right? That's how the work flows. And so the idea is now your various groupings, whether they're teams or not, are in fact considered a pool. And the boundaries around them need to be porous. They need to not sort of have this idea that it's a cohesive and rigid group, because that creates points of friction, delay. It's not about reconfiguring teams and saying, okay, this solid team is now going to be disbanded and recreated. It's about, okay, so we have to move so-and-so over there, so-and-so over here. Why? Because we can see what's going on. So the idea here is that your new tribe is a service. So the tribalism is not gone. It's a question of where is it located. All right? So you're dealing with moving up the maturity model to say, I am going to go and subordinate needs away from this concept of utilizing various team compositions, but really talking about how to do this at a full service level, right? So that kind of changes some of the interaction that you might experience in terms of what is the identity of individuals. Are we this squad? Or are we about the service? Do we understand our customers? Is it all about that? Now, so what do you get? I mean, so in this example, now you have reconfigured groups, potentially, is one way of doing it. And so now you've got the right amount of circles available so that the top priorities are actually being worked on. So in this scenario, we don't work on diamonds, or sorry, the triangles, right? The purple triangle that we saw in the earlier example, it's got to wait. And it may never get started because newer options may show up in the time it takes to deliver some of the other stuff that we were committing to. The other thing is, so going back to appropriateness, is So clearly you need to have some sort of feedback loop for your service to even know how to do this, right? So, how do you know how you should be configuring, how to make those changes? So the scope of visibility needs to now be at the service level. So if you're not doing service level Kanban, you can't do this, right? The two need to be there. The other thing that you probably need to also realize is you're crossing political boundaries. So, there's an example of a group in finance, and they really needed to close their books because they were finalizing their period for an audit. And if they failed the audit, there were kind of two problems. One, it was a huge reputational issue, right? So can't even get our books closed in time. And there's a fine of about $500,000. Now, at the same time, that same team was required for a product that had some financial implications on it, and delay to the market was somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 million. Where did finance go? Where did they pour their energy? Any guesses? Who thinks closing the books? Who thinks the product? Yeah, closing the books won, right? And so you can't really ignore functional directives and needs that are driven from how these are how your organizations are built. So if finance is all about our job is to keep the books clean, you might have to understand there might be some time how to figure out how to get them to participate in the delivery of service, right? Because they may introduce stops because it makes sense for them, because they have different goals. Their goals are not on the delivery of a particular service. Their goals are the delivery of their particular function. HR, hiring people. Marketing, all sorts of marketing opportunities. So this disconnected nature is another thing that you want to understand before you would take on a liquidity model like this, because if there's all sorts of factions within your organization, you may have to figure out how to deal with that. Or you may want to try this with one service where that is maybe not so pronounced. So again, thinking about the appropriateness. And then going back to Kanban cadences, if you don't have a mature service delivery review, you can't pull this off, right? You don't have the visibility to make quality decisions. So let's go up a little bit further and go into organizational liquidity. So this is kind of building up on, everything, but certainly on the last one, the service liquidity part, where now we're thinking about the whole organization as a whole. So not about a service, but really a collection of services, right? So again, you go in a grocery store, and one thing is clear: they know how to make trade-offs, right? They know that, it doesn't make sense to have a whole shelf of almond milk, maybe just a section, right? They know that only a certain amount of butter is going to be there and what brands. So the idea here is the fact that they have limited shelf space has just put them in a position of being really good at trade-offs. And so organizational liquidity is really about organizations being really good at trade-offs, right? So what services are they actually going to be putting out to market? Which ones aren't? And to what size, right? And so what this does is now get you into the game of realizing that your services are not the same size. So the idea is these arrows have different thickness. And some of them should get a larger share of your resources. And so now the idea is you're dealing with the scarcity of your skills in your organization, but ensuring that those with the most economic benefit, or at least the thought behind that around aligning with your strategy, is supported. And so now you're giving up, and you're doing trade-offs between your services, and the critical ones are getting more attention than others. And so from that perspective, if you're building a Kanban board to visualize this, then it may have to look a little bit different than your standard board, right? So this is an example of one I did with a group where they wanted to get visualization on their various how they were balanced against various different strategic goals that they had. So essentially saying, you know what, we've identified a bunch of pipes, and we're actually using things like WIP limits to decide how big those pipes are. Where are the various things against those pipes? So now it's like a 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional grid rather than just a straight left to right board. But the idea is a Kanban board at the level of an organization now has to deal with different things, in this case dealing with trade-offs. All right? And how do you go about visualizing that? So now here at the 5th and 6th maturity level, you're dealing with an ecosystem of a pool of skill capabilities across a number of services. And so this becomes more and more dynamic. And so, without, you could probably guess it, the boundary of the tribe is now no longer even the service, right? So this is not you're not individuals say, I'm attached to this particular customer group, this particular product, this particular set of services, but the expectation that the organization can organize rapidly and effectively based on their strategic priorities. So again, going back to a Kanban cadence perspective, if you don't have mature operational reviews and strategy reviews, you can't pull this off. It's not possible, right? You won't have the visibility to make good decisions. So that's kind of how the whole thing stacks together. There's 5 levels across the 7 KMM levels. Again, I said this at the start, it's not really about where you should be, but what's appropriate, right? So the last thing I want you to do is like leave today and say, okay, I'm going to go back and let's go in and introduce the organizational liquidity model to my organization, right? Be honest, where are you at today? That's your starting point. And so, I've worked with groups that do Kanban and say, oh, we're still doing cross-functional teams, and I know that's not really about how Kanban is, so should we abandon that? And they're like, well, maybe not. Right? If that's what you could pull off today, then that's our starting point, and let's figure out if that's something that we can go beyond. And it may mean something like, okay, so what's the potential for service delivery reviews, and is that something that we can do? And if not, maybe the other stuff waits. Okay? So that's SLiMM. Thank you very much.